everyone. I'm going to be uploading Saturday's video today because I am not going to be having time on Saturday to make videos. Neither Sunday, so I'll be doing Sunday's video too. So without further ado, for this underrated film Saturday, I thought it would be interesting to dive into something that's animated again. And as you can see by the title as well as the thumbnail, we're going to be discussing The Emperor's New Groove. Yes. This story, in particular this Disney animated film, is underrated for, I think, a variety of reasons. But at the same time, it is ridiculous. It is goofy. It is nothing that usually we would consider traditionally Disney. And, it's not designed to be this grand, epic, sweeping, groundbreaking piece of art. In so much as it's just trying to be a simple film, but I also think it brings up a lot of sort of interesting concepts that you usually don't see in Disney films. And I think this was definitely a time when Disney was sort of detouring from their sort of traditional formula. So obviously they were kind of experimenting, and I think this one overall works. Is it anywhere close to where the Renaissance films were? No, I wouldn't say that. But at the same time, I still think that it's funny, and I think it's engaging, and I think it's interesting in the way in which they sort of constructed this film. Even though it is, again, a little ridiculous. The plot centers around an emperor, played by David Spade, named Kuzco. And he becomes a llama. In the most crazy and ridiculous of circumstances. So basically, the whole story centers around him trying to turn back into a llama. And you'll see how John Goodman's character, who is a peasant, comes into this plot, as well as two villains who are also very enjoyable and the best characters in the entire film. Now, I know this plot sounds ridiculous, like David Spade turning into a llama. Like, what in the world? How is this possible? How can this in any way, shape, or form be a decent Disney movie? And my response to that is a couple of things. One, as far as comedy is concerned, I think comedically this film works more to its advantage than its disadvantage, because it has a very out there scenario. Again, with David Spade turning into a llama. Now, even though I don't particularly care for David Spade's character pretty much throughout the entire film, there are still some likable and enjoyable moments. And at the same time, even though I don't think David Spade's character is all that funny, I think like the sort of circumstances that he ends up finding himself in, where he just kind of where he gets kind of just beat up because he's such a jerk, I think really works. And that's what makes this film, I think, very engaging to watch. Is just to see this guy just fall every time. Even though you think he's on top at one moment, and then he just completely collapses on himself. And although I would say, I guess an issue might be in regards to, as far as David Spade's development and when he becomes of a more likable character at the end, that it is kind of maybe a little bit rushed. But I think at the same time they do try to show some gradual shift where you see him in the beginning as a complete jerk, and the reason he gets turned into a llama is because he's a complete jerk. Because basically this emperor, in particular David Spade, Spade's character, is very self-absorbed. I mean, he's probably the most self-absorbed character I've ever seen in Disney. He is so full of himself that you wouldn't think that there is anybody else on his mind beside himself. He is very egotistical. He wants things his way or the highway. Um, and you'll see how that doesn't sit well with John Goodman's character. Also, though not so much with the villains either. Um, but that's what leads to the comedy. Um, is the fact that we have this protagonist who is such a jerk. We rarely see that in Disney, where we have a character that we loathe pretty much throughout the entire thing. And then on the one hand, we have this other character who's fairly likable, John Goodman's character. Um, and although I would say they are sort of playing themselves, like the actors, you could make that argument, I think, more so for the protagonists. Um, I think they bounce off each other fairly well. Because you see how, how humble John Goodman's character is, and then you just see um, how just uh, egotistical David Spade's character is, and it gels out really well. And I think that's what ultimately works well into the comedy as far as with the protagonists are concerned. And usually in a lot of these kinds of, friendship films, because again, it is supposed to be a friendship film, you'll see how the John Goodman's character as well as David Spade's character sort of have to, are kind of forced to sort of go on a journey together in order to, get David Spade turned back into a human. And some people might say, and I think the Nostalgia Critic made this argument that, oh, it's just a buddy comedy. And although it has those kinds of cliche, you could argue, elements in there, I think usually the buddy comedy thing or the buddy road trip act usually has someone who's fairly smart and then someone who's a complete idiot. And they're annoying and obnoxious in that way. They're they may have a good heart, really. I mean, and usually that's how the buddy comedies usually work. You have a dumb guy and then you have a really smart guy. And the smart guy is really trying hard to put up with the dumb guy. And that's usually how these buddy road trip movies work. They're designed on that kind of a formula. But here, David Spade, although he has his dumb moments within this film, as far as intelligence level is concerned, they're probably on the same playing field as characters. But the difference is David Spade's character is just so unbelievably uncaring towards John Goodman's character and lacks any sense of appreciation or or any kind of consideration for John Goodman's character, the peasants, you know, uh, the peasant character. He David Spade's character just lacks any kind of how do you say it? He just does not care about the peasant character Pacha, but then he eventually starts to care, and that's usually sort of, it's developed kind of gradually, but again, I think it could have been probably executed a little better, but at the same time, I think overall that's what I think makes this sort of buddy road trip, even though it's really not so much of a buddy road trip. I mean, that's not a huge part of the story. Yeah, there's like detours and things like that they end up taking, but that's not the entire film. You still have the sort of beginning where he ultimately becomes a llama, and then you have him sort of being on his own, and then eventually having to rely on Pacha, aka John Goodman, to sort of survive, so to speak. And then you eventually see how there is some kind of misunderstanding that ends up happening. But again, it's really quick. It doesn't take up a huge majority of the film, and it doesn't really necessarily make up the climax of the film, which I think was definitely a good move as far as a buddy comedy sort of is concerned. But I like the idea Disney kind of going with this approach, because we usually don't see them do it. It's very rare that you ever see Disney kind of go on this sort of level. Um, and what I do like too is I think the film is self-aware that it is designed to not be this grandiose, comedy, or this grandiose, epic adventure. It's just designed to be this simple, nice animated film and not try to be anything, I think, more than that. And I think that the fact that it is self-aware, I think, really works to the film's advantage. Now, I need to discuss one more thing in regards to this film, um, and and then I'll sort of discuss again my reasoning as to why I think it is a little bit overlooked. Um, the villains are one of the, if not the most enjoyable thing about this movie. These villains are just great. You've got this very evil, um, kind of self-absorbed too, you know, uh, older lady named Yzma, who's like the main honcho villain. And then she has her sidekick, who's Kronk, who's like this really buff but not the sharpest tool in the shed kind of guy. And their moments together are just so great. Um, because and that's the kind of the funny thing too, is you almost have two kinds of road trips kind of going on here. You have the two villains sort of kind of um you know going out and finding the protagonists, and you'll see how that happens if you choose to watch the film. And then you have these or then you have the protagonists who are trying to sort of get along, but then are have their own sort of agendas too. So that, I think, works out really well, because we usually don't see villains that are like the ones that we see in this film, especially from Disney. I mean, Disney has produced some very serious and very kind of just creepy and in your face villains, with very dark agendas and motivations, and they're developed to a certain extent. Here, you can kind of understand where these villains are coming from, but at the same time, they're completely over the top, and they, everything is so over exaggerated. And that's kind of the idea, and I think this film knew going in that this was supposed to be a kind of, ridiculous film. It wasn't designed to be this grandiose, epic, classic. It wasn't meant to be that. And I think that's one of the reasons why I think this film is actually rather unique and enjoyable to watch. And I mean, just the timing of and the lines and all of that just I think works well to this film, and lends itself for innocent child, kid slash kid comedy, family comedy. Um, Now, as far as the reasons why I think it is a little overlooked, again, like I mentioned before, this film came out during a time when Disney wasn't really at its top A game anymore. So I think it is understandable that this film would probably get pushed under the bus. Also, it's not what you expect from Disney. Usually Disney doesn't go full comedy. They don't go for the full comedic effect, because a lot of the times Disney animation has a range of different emotions throughout their films. This one is pure comedy. It's not designed to be anything else. Um, and I think that's also something that threw people off. Again, also me explaining to you the plot. I mean, David Spade is a llama in this film. Like, already people are like, nope, no way. And that's even what turned the nostalgia critic off from it, was because it was so, the plot was just ridiculous. But I like ridiculous plots. I mean, yeah, you're probably gonna get a couple of stinkers now and again that, try to use a ridiculous plot, but sometimes I think they end up working. And I think for this film, it more worked than I think it didn't. Obviously, it has flaws, but I still think it's a decent animated film. Also, um, not only is the scenario ridiculous, but we also have a different set of sort of relationships and kinds of morals that this film addresses. Usually, and a lot of the time, Disney films have been more centered around on fairy tales, on things of magic and such. And although this film has magic in it, it's not really the main focus. I mean, it's part of the plot, but it's um it's not designed to be that whimsical kind of you know film that we see in a lot of the classics that Disney has produced in the past. Um, and in doing so, I think that's why people don't usually take it that seriously. But I think it is still addressing some very interesting moral ideas to kids. I mean, yeah, we sort of learned about, being spoiled and selfish and unkind by the Beast, but we never really saw him so much um, being that way. Just he was just kind of misunderstood, and I mean, he's kind of more based within angst and frustration and anger. He's just kind of whiny, a whiny character, and then he eventually turns nice. Whereas with Cusco's character, the moral thing here is not only just, sort of the idea of not being so self uh, centered, but seeing things through other people's perspective, and realizing that you know not everything really does revolve around you. And I think with the Beast's character was more about him learning to be kind and letting down his defenses, whereas with Cusco's character, he it was just about him learning not being a jerk. And I think sometimes kids can relate to that, because I think sometimes kids, they'll grow up in a very spoiled environment, where they're catered to every whim, which is basically how they show Cusco within the beginning, as being completely self-absorbed and catered to everything. And then eventually we see how with this journey he sort of learns, to let that guard down, um, and to focus more on what uh, other people think, and what their desires are and things like that, and not making everything just about what he ultimately wants. um, and I think that's just something that's really good for kids to learn, because I mean, it's just done in a very creative and interesting way. Um, so I think overall it's very enjoyable. Is it for everybody? No. Is the comedy for everybody? No. But at the same time, I still think it is addressing some things that we usually don't see in a lot of animated films. And it's nice to see this kind of simple, more comedic approach from Disney. Um, I think we eventually see this within later on within other films. Tangled, I think, tried to approach that similar level of comedic effect. Um, Maybe Wreck-It Ralph to a certain extent, but I think Tangled probably wins as far as comedy is concerned. But I think overall, it's nice to see this kind of a story sort of, being told, and I think it's ultimately, I think it serves its audience at its purpose well. If you have kids who really like enjoy comedy and enjoy kinds of ridiculous scenarios, then they'll enjoy this, and I think even adults can find some enjoyment out of it. But I think that's really ultimately all I can say about this film without giving too much away. But thank you so much for watching. I hope you all have a pleasant day, week, month, and year. And I hope to see you on the next video. Take care.